So, from the Volcker Alliance and the Penn Institute for Urban Research, this is Special Briefing. I'm Bill Glasgall at the Alliance, and I'm here with my co host at Penn IUR, Susan Wachter. So, again, hello, Susan.
Hello.
And sorry for that little interruption. We're coming to you in the middle of Earth Week, and today our focus is on America's water crisis and how states, counties, cities, and ratepayers like you and me are going to address an infrastructure need that could total at least $900 billion and probably way more. Drinking water, stormwater, sewage, flood mitigation, lead, and forever chemicals like PFAS, the list goes on and on. To help define the problem and hopefully propose some solutions, we have a noteworthy expert panel on hand today, led by former U.S. Senator Bill Bradley. But first, a few words. We're coming to you live on the Volcker Alliance and the Penn IUR websites, and also on the Special Briefing podcast. We've taken your questions in advance and we'll pose them later in the program. And of course, this special briefing is made possible with the support of the Volcker Alliance, members of the Penn IUR Board of Advisors, and the Century Foundation. And now let's get back in the water. We're honored to have Senator Bradley start us off with his perspective as a former member of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. We'll then turn to Philadelphia to hear Howard Newkirk, Executive Director of the Water Center at University of Pennsylvania, and Nicole Lick, Senior Life Scientist in the Water Division of the EPA. From Texas, we'll get a mini case study of the huge Vista Ridge water supply project from Doug Evanson, Executive Vice President and CFO of the San Antonio Water System. And for a perspective on how to pay for the nation's water needs, we'll bring in Reese Tisdale, President and CEO of Bluefield Research in Boston. Welcome to you all. And so now let's begin with Senator Bradley. He's the chair of the Volcker Alliance Board of Directors, the former New York Knicks luminary and Basketball Hall of Fame member, and most recently a video star. So do catch his captivating film Rolling Along on Max. Senator Bradley also sponsored the groundbreaking Central Valley Improvement Act, reforming how water is allocated in California, and he remains focused on water issues. So, Senator, the mic is yours.
Thank you very much, Bill. Let me compliment you for having this issue as one of the subjects that your group has discussed over the years. This is a tremendously important issue. I was born in Missouri and I represented New Jersey in the United States Senate, and it rains in both places, right? So we didn't have much problem with water. But for 18 years, I was on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and for 10 of those years, I was chairman of the Water and Power Subcommittee. And the Water and Power Subcommittee had jurisdiction over all the water west of roughly the 40th parallel. And it's about 16 Western states. And I did that in part because I understood how central water was to the life in these states. And so I wanted to understand that part of America, and I felt that water was a good way to do that. I discovered things that I had not anticipated, had never known. And it ultimately focused down onto probably the biggest thing that we did in those years, which was the reform of the Central Valley Project in California. And for those that don't know, the Central Valley Project is 350 miles from Mount Shasta to the Tehachapi Range in southern part of California, and embodies two river systems. One is the Sacramento River, and the other is the San Joaquin. And the Central Valley was a desert, basically. And Harold Ickes, who was the Interior Secretary of FDR, had the idea that, well, we could build some dams, we could do some canals, and the result was the Central Valley Project. Its most audacious aspect is the San Joaquin River flows north into the Sacramento Bay. The Sacramento River flows south into the Sacramento Bay. What the Central Valley Project did was, and if you ever fly over the project, as I have, it's absolutely startling. Here's the San Joaquin River heading north, and suddenly there's a gap. It's about a 10-mile gap. The riverbed is dry. And what happened was the Central Valley Project built a peripheral canal so that the river is pulled up into a peripheral canal and then heads south into the Central Valley, irrigating most of the crops that we eat and fruits and some of the vegetables in this country today. And it's the most productive agriculture in the country, but it is premised upon access to water. And access to water was provided primarily by the federal government. There is a state project that parallels it, but primarily the federal government. And over the years, farmers and large landowners came to take water at $15 an acre foot, as opposed to San Diego, where it was like several $100s an acre foot, for granted. And the result also was, as California expanded, there was tremendous demand for urban water and industrial water. But this whole system aimed to support the farmers in the Central Valley at a grossly subsidized rate. They pay about $230 million out of several billion dollars. That's the degree of the subsidy. And so what we did, and I think this is probably going to increasingly be the case in water policy in most places where there are these problems. And what we did was to say that the water can be sold to urban users as well as to farmers. Farmers have the first right, but there would be market prices. And we then also reserved a certain amount of water for the environment, for the fowl and fish and so forth. And it was at the time a breakthrough legislation. This was back in the Paleolithic era in 1992. And it still stands today. It hasn't worked exactly as we thought it would, but it has definitely improved the allocation of water in California. Now, that's only one aspect. I mean, I read a story in the newspaper the other day about Arizona and how Arizona has a real crisis. Well, in Arizona, there's the Central Arizona Project, right? Which brings water from the Colorado down to Phoenix and other places in Arizona. And if you have continued drought, you could have large segments of the West without access to water. And then you have the conflicts that exist between the farmers and industry and urban uses. And so this is a terribly important subject that not many people focus on unless they're in the business. But it is of great general interest to the rest of the country because we're talking about areas of the United States that are vast in territory and increasingly the fastest growing urban populations in the country. And so I think this is a great thing to have us focus on here at the Volcker Alliance, and I salute you for your leadership on it, Bill.
Thanks very much, Senator. Susan?
Yes, thank you.
Next.
Thank you so much, Senator. And we are very grateful for your leadership and for joining us today and for staying with us to the questions and answers. And now it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce the founding director of the Water Center and professor of practice in global water at the University of Pennsylvania, and also with a pioneer with 50 years experience in water and the previous CEO of Philadelphia Water. It is my distinct pleasure to be a friend and also to be a student, to learn so much from Howard and New Krug. And so Howard, teach us all some.
Thank you, Susan and Bill and Senator Bradley. So great to hear you and see you still in this business, and thank you for being here. I'm the founding director of the Water Center at the University of Pennsylvania. I come to that after about 40 years at the Philadelphia Water Department and doing just about doing many of the different jobs through my career there, ending up as the executive director of the utility. And at the Water Center, what we're interested in is community, equity, science, resilience, and justice. Those are our core values. And when we look at the global water situation, we're really looking at there's only three things that can be wrong with water. There could be too much, there could be too little, or it could be too dirty. And those three simple things start to become very, very, very complex when you start looking locally. When I say locally, you can talk about a rural area, urban area. You can look at a part of an urban area and a community. And what we try to do is find the right local solutions to our global water challenges and the watersheds that support those cities and communities and the communities that rely on them. I've been asked to talk about, and Bill said it very quickly at the beginning there, and I'll spend a minute more on top challenges of the water sector today. And right on top of the whole list there is climate change. And it's funny because we're water, and then we have another center at that University of Pennsylvania, it's the Energy Center, and they've been getting all the press. They've been getting all the press because we're talking about fossil fuels and how do we reduce that and how do we change our energy world. And but I started realizing that energy is really about mitigating. And I'm not really, and I'm sorry to say this, but I think we all recognize that we're not doing so well with mitigating right now. And what do? What's your second step? You adapt and fortify. And where do you have to work on that? Those issues are really issues of the water industry. Whether you're talking sea level rise, droughts, floods, heat, extreme weather, these are all things that are being dealt with by the water sector. And one of the questions we have out there is about levels of service. Is the level of service that's provided today, is that what needs to be provided tomorrow? And if so, how much is that going to cost? Implementing new technologies. It's amazing how much the water industry has changed in the last 10 years and certainly 20, 30 years looking back. But the concept of reusing water, particularly in the West and other parts of the world, is a new technology that's there and growing, and as is desalination. And the last piece I'll talk about new technology is that energy is the biggest user of water in the US, and water is the biggest user of energy in any city. And so a big part of the water industry right now is looking at how do we become energy independent of the grid system? How do we produce enough energy through renewables and through methane gases to be self-reliant and resilient? Because resiliency is the key to everything. And resiliency means how do you get to a point where you can fail, but how quickly can you restart? How quickly can you get water back up to a community? And that's really a big challenge for the water industry. We're of course looking at the new regulations of PFAS and the lead service line replacement. Huge costs associated with both of those. And this thing that's not been talked about very much, but is the implications of this PFAS regulation on a relook of existing regulations of volatile organic carcinogens that are in the water, and whether that's going to need to change and how that's going to change the entire sense of what is considered a conventional water treatment plant in the United States. Aging infrastructure, aging workforce. I'm a principal example of that. Interest rates, inflation, all of these things are really hitting us hard right now, and particularly they're hitting small and disadvantaged communities. And the last thing I'll just say is, in terms of water, it's a very fixed product, and the demographic shifts in population, as well as industry, they're moving to places where there is no water. So you're adding on these new costs that you need to do in order to make sure there's enough water everywhere. So I'm going to talk very quickly about three separate items. One is tariffs and rates, federal support, and I'm going to finish with talking about human right to water. In terms of tariffs, tariffs, in my mind, there's a 6% need to raise rates every year in the water business. And that is just to deal with inflation. It may be a couple of new programs, but basically inflation, because inflation hits the water industry hard because what do we spend money on? We spend it on chemicals, we spend it on labor, we spend it on energy. And we look at this, and I look at this number, I've been looking at this number, $900 billion over 20 years. I've been looking at that for a while now. First I rounded up to $1 trillion, and then I double it to $2 trillion is what's really needed if we're really to achieve what we talked about in the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and to provide the kind of water quality and environment that we all expect and deserve. In terms of federal support, it's really interesting to note that, like, unlike the energy and transportation industries, the water industry typically gets about 5% of its funding from the federal government. Everything else is very local and locally oriented. And there are three big funding opportunities that came through the federal government that I'd like to just mention briefly. And the first is the construction grants program, which came with the Clean Water Act, where 75 to 90% of the funding for wastewater plants was to upgrade those plants. And that had an incredible change in the quality of water in the United States. And the second one is the ARRA in 2009, $13.5 billion came in. And that money was very, very important because it did not provide new money to the industry, but it provided a replacement money for the monies that the water industry could not get from Wall Street, and kept things going and kept people working, and was very successful. And of course, now the bipartisan infrastructure bill with $50 billion is really great. And the one caveat to that is just looking at the amount of inflation that's going on in local construction business in order to try to build up to the point where they have the capacity to do all the work that they're doing. I see I'm running out of time, so I'm going to jump really quickly to the human rights to water and sanitation. And you know, this is something that started very much globally, but now has been focused more on the US. And recognizing that while the human right to water does not mean that water must be free, it must, however, be affordable, particularly to those with little or no income. And the impact of that on Philadelphia alone is, in 2024, we're having a 14% rate increase. 6% of that is for what we talked about earlier, which is just minor programs and inflationary factors, just keeping up with our systems and inflation and other things. And the other 6% is for providing all Philadelphians affordable water through discounts to low-income water customers. The cost of service to everyone else is going up, and the rate of that is going to be about a 6% hit on water bills in Philadelphia. So with that, I'll pass it back to you, Susan and Bill, and thank you for inviting me onto this call.
Well, thanks, Howard, for that great overview. And this is a reminder that you're tuned into Special Briefing from the Volcker Alliance and Penn IUR. The archived editions of all the special briefings are on our websites and the Special Briefing podcast. And now back to Susan. And Susan, you're muted. If you wouldn't mind unmuting your mic, please. Well,
Very good. Thank you very much. Sorry, Bill. Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Howard. Thank you, Bill. Our next speaker is Nicole Lick, and she's here, local in Philadelphia, and a senior life scientist at the EPA. And Nicole Lick will be able to provide us some perspective on how much we have achieved so far in the goals of the clean water and safe drinking and the challenges ahead. Nicole?
Thank you so much, Susan, and thank you for having me. I just want to start by saying infrastructure investments are hard. They're expensive, they're long-term, they don't fit neatly into our election cycles, They're investments in the future when we'd rather fund things with more immediate benefits. The technology sometimes is innovative and unproven, and still it's critical that we make them happen. From a water infrastructure perspective, our discussion is timely. 52 years ago, the Clean Water Act resulted in federal water infrastructure investments over a 10-year period of time to the tune of $200 billion if you adjust for today's dollar. And as Howard mentioned, that investment was incredibly successful in cleaning up our water. But it also means that our water infrastructure is aging and nearing the end of its lifespan and requires upgrades or replacement. In 2022, the bipartisan infrastructure law provided $50 billion in funding to the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, to help improve the nation's drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure. This funding is delivered mostly to the state revolving fund programs, or SRF programs. And that funding is given through the state to communities as a mix of loans and grants. Each state has its own timeline, processes, and affordability criteria for project selection under the SRF program, and they have their own processes for determining which portions of that funding are distributed as a loan versus a grant. I want to take a minute to talk about the different types of funding that were included in the bipartisan infrastructure law. The Clean Water State Revolving Fund provides financing and funding for a wide variety of water quality projects to help meet the requirements of the Clean Water Act. Project examples might include improving municipal wastewater facilities, non-point source pollution controls, and decentralized wastewater treatment systems. Some other examples include stormwater runoff mitigation, green infrastructure, estuary protection, and water reuse. Additionally, there's the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund, which helps provide funding to meet the objectives of the Safe Water Drinking Act. And project examples there might include improvements to drinking water treatment, water transmission and distribution, improving and protecting source water supplies, and has dedicated funding for lead service line identification and replacement. Both programs, the Drinking Water and Clean Water State Revolving Funds, have a 2% set aside to support water infrastructure improvements within tribes and Alaskan Native villages. And also, both programs have money that will be distributed as 100% grant, not a loan, to help address PFAS contamination and other emerging contaminants. In addition to the $50 billion in funding that came from the bipartisan infrastructure law, EPA also established technical assistance providers across the country where communities can request no-cost direct technical assistance to help evaluate their drinking water, wastewater, stormwater, and water quality improvement needs. As we've discussed, $50 billion is a historic amount of funding, but doesn't cover the $900 billion need, as the title of this event highlights. That $900 billion estimate comes from a combination of the 2021 Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey, which estimated the need for drinking water infrastructure at $625 billion, and the 2012 Clean Water Infrastructure Needs Survey, which estimated the need on the clean water side at about $271 billion. This estimate is low, as Howard alluded to. He's, multiplying and doubling. It's low because we're still awaiting the results of the 2022 Clean Water Needs Survey. They are not out yet, but no doubt will increase the need on the clean water side. And additionally, if we're subscribing to the one water approach, which I suggest we do, where we're managing all water, whether from a tap, a stream, an aquifer, a storm, a sewer, in a collaborative, inclusive way, then we have to recognize that these estimates don't include any of the costs needed to mitigate flood risks. And as a former FEMA employee, I would be remiss not to mention that. It's also really important to note that this need, whatever the right number is of the estimate, is largely going to be the responsibility of local governments. Howard mentioned that they're currently funding about 95 to 98% of all water infrastructure capital, operations, and maintenance investments. And local governments are investing in water infrastructure in record numbers. Between 1993 and 2019, local governments invested more than 2.3 trillion with a T dollars. And for scale, that's a single year commitment from local governments in 2021 of $148 billion. Because local government funding comes largely from ratepayers and municipal bonds, that means we collectively need to focus on affordability. I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about how we can work together to affect the changes needed to ensure that we can allocate the required resources to manage all of our water needs. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Nicole. We're going to turn to Doug Evanson now, CFO of like Howard. He's a water guy. It's a CFO of San Antonio Water, and tell us about the Vista Ridge project. This is a huge project to supply water for decades, God willing, to a very fast-growing city. And tell us about the project and also how you're going to recover your costs for ratepayers and for investors. This being one of the biggest public-private partnerships in the water industry to date.
Oh, thank you, Bill. And good morning to all of our guests. As Bill indicated this morning, I'd like to discuss with you San Antonio Water Systems, or SAWS for short, Vista Ridge Water Supply Project. This project has been recognized nationally as one of the largest public-private partnerships to be constructed in North America. Before discussing the project, I want to take just a minute to discuss the historical water supply position of San Antonio and SAWS in particular. SAWS is by far the predominant provider of both water and sewer services within San Antonio and surrounding Bexar County. Historically, San Antonio had obtained all of its water from the Edwards Aquifer. However, given the more than 400,000 new residents that moved to Bexar County during the 20-year period from 1980 to 2000, when we grew from just under 1 million residents to approximately 1.4 million, San Antonio needed to identify other sources of water and developed its first comprehensive water resource plan for San Antonio in 1998. This plan called for several initiatives, including further enhanced conservation efforts, the continued development of one of the nation's largest direct recycled water systems, the construction of an aquifer storage and recovery project, or ASR, which involves injecting groundwater into an aquifer during rainy times and then retrieving it for future use when needed. And finally, the continued evaluation and ultimate development of several new water supplies. While the organization has had tremendous success in reducing demand through conservation initiatives, while simultaneously constructing our 130-mile recycled water network and our award-winning ASR, the development of sizable new potable water supplies proved quite challenging. At the same time, population growth in the county only accelerated, growing by another 320,000 people, or 23% in the decade from 2000 to 2010. You think about that in terms of a size of city of 320,000 coming onto our, coming to San Antonio each and every 10 years. While not having previously participated in any large-scale public-private partnerships, and maybe being even a little bit skeptical as to the potential responses, in 2011, SAWS developed and distributed a request for competitive sealed proposals for water supply projects to provide San Antonio up to 50,000 acre-feet of water a year. We were looking for a solution in which the private entity would willingly take on all risk associated with delivery of water to our receiving site in Bexar County. In particular, this included the regulatory risk associated with groundwater permits issued and regulated by locally elected groundwater districts. SAWS would agree to pay for all water up to the 50,000 acre feet contractual limit made available at the delivery point. A total of 9 proposals were received, from which 3 finalists were selected and interviewed prior to determining that the Vista Ridge project was the preferred alternative. The identification of Vista Ridge as the preferred alternative kicked off a period of time-consuming and challenging negotiations to finalize an agreement. Among some of the contentious issues were SAW's desire or even need as a public agency for transparency in the negotiations, while the private entities preferred a little bit less transparency. The assumption of risk associated with Texas groundwater regulation that I previously discussed, and SAW's desire to have the price to be paid for water tied to prevailing interest rates at the time of financial close, as well as an interest rate cap, so we knew we had a finite cap on what we would actually pay for this water. As an incentive to achieve financial close as quickly as possible during this period of historically low borrowing costs, SAWS also wanted an option to lock in the price of water after 18 months if, for whatever reason, financial close had not yet occurred. In 2014, both SAWS board and the San Antonio City Council approved the execution of the Water Transmission and Purchase Agreement, or WTPA, under which up to 50,000 acre feet of potable water is to be made available to SAWS, and SAWS has agreed to pay for this water for a term of 30 years. After that term, the water will actually revert to SAWS and will have ownership of the project. To produce and deliver the water to be made available to SAWS, the project company was to develop the well fields and construct a 142-mile pipeline from the well field to SAWS delivery point in northern Bexar County. While the signing of the WTPA was a huge accomplishment, there were still many challenges to overcome. Some of the hurdles which had to be still overcome during the development and construction phase of the project were financial difficulties within the primary initial counterparty to the agreement, which caused them to sell controlling interest in the project to another firm. Delays in financial close resulting from that change in ownership, during which SAWS did go ahead and exercise its option to lock in the price of water. That was a scary point for the project. The project company needing to obtain easements on more than 500 parcels of property in order to construct the pipeline. And finally, the inability of SAWS to keep pace with the private contractors in the construction of our needed infrastructure improvements in order to be able to receive that much water, resulting in SAWS not being able to accept the full allotment of water upon it first being made available. So delivery of project water to SAWS did begin on April 15, 2020, with SAWS actually beginning to take all available project water beginning in July of 2020 when we'd finished our work. So the project has now been operational for 4 years, and it has been a remarkable success, providing SAWS the agreed upon 50,000 acre feet a year for each of the last 3 years. At the same time, growth has remained strong within Bexar County, having added another 300,000 new residents in the 10-year period from 2010 to 2020, and having recently been cited as having the 3rd largest numeric increase in population for cities with populations of 50,000 or more in 2022. At the same time, San Antonio, and in particular the surrounding regions just north and west of San Antonio, which provide most of the recharge for our primary source of supply, the Edwards Aquifer, remain in extreme drought conditions, severely reducing SAWS permitted allocation of Edwards Aquifer water supplies, which were cut by almost 36%, or 95,000 acre feet in 2023 alone. The Vista Ridge water supply was therefore essential to SAWS meeting its demand requirements in 2023. In closing, I would just like to offer my opinion that at a minimum, the Vista Ridge project could not have been completed in the same time frame without the P3 structure of the project. And it, in my opinion, is a very real possibility that this vital project would not have been completed at all without this structure. So thank you, Bill, and I'll turn it back to you.
Well, thanks so much, Doug, and thanks for that mini case study of innovation in the business. We're going to move on to Boston now, which incidentally, almost 100 years ago, had a similar solution to a similar problem of a fast-growing metropolitan area. Went and built the beautiful Quabbin Reservoir, 65 miles west of the city, to assure a clean, dependable water supply for Eastern Mass. Reese Tisdale is in downtown Boston, watches the water industry very closely. So give us the lowdown on how all these needs are going to be financed. We've had every speaker so far talk about the need. What's the solution?
Oh, that's the $900 billion question and then some, it sounds like, Bill. So I really appreciate you having me on to talk about this. Obviously, we're all in the water sector, as I think Howard, sort of alluded to it. There's, and everybody else for that matter, we've all are facing water, wastewater crises of different kinds. But I think, and that's one reason Bluefield Research has really gotten into this, is to provide some what would hopefully actionable data and insights to talk a little bit about the industry. And in the previous speakers and guests have talked about the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. I mean, it's a significant milestone, $55 billion of new funding towards the water, wastewater sector, which since whether it be ARRA, but even since Clean Water Act, since 1976, federal funding towards the water sector has shifted largely away from the federal government, as Nicole pointed out, from about 15-16% back then in 76 to about 1 to 5% now. So it really has been pushed on the local communities, local governments, to address the challenges that they face. And the bottom line is there are 50,000 water systems in the US. There are another 18 to 23,000 wastewater systems, drinking water systems, about 50,000. So it's incredibly fragmented. Everybody's got their own fiefdom and how to manage it. And, just for added context, I was looking at some AWWA, the American Waterworks Association. They had said that 85% of the water systems in the US employ less than 3 people. So that kind of shows you the fragmentation and the scale of what we're dealing with. So $900 billion. So what is that, Bill? Well, according to Bluefield Research, when we look at it, we're looking at about $175 billion, at least by our numbers, of capital and operating expenditures that have to be paid out in any given year. That will continue to rise. Obviously, COVID, inflation, geopolitics, all of the above is really cutting into that, to a point of which projects have been deferred, put off, because of whether it be the cost of capital or whether it just be the cost of equipment. So IIJA. So when we looked at it, we've done some analysis and we looked at about $63 billion. That's IIJA. We're also including Western Water going into the water and wastewater sector. Of that, about 85% of that is really, as Nicole pointed out, goes to the state revolving funds. Pretty significant, well established. Every state gets to manage, sort of its problems or issues and direct the funding to higher priority projects. So we're halfway through the program. Well, when we look at the outlays, how much has actually been paid out to date, only 6% has been paid out to date from IIJA. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. One, like I mentioned, so every state is a little bit different, has its own process, and this is across 10 programs, but also Build American, Buy American has created some challenges that have slowed processes. Cost, like I said, cost of materials, cost of projects, cost of labor is pretty significant. So how do we overcome that? Well, I think, everybody's excited. I think the tailwinds are there. When you look at all the financials of all the companies across the supply chain, the engineering companies, even the utilities, I think everybody's pretty excited about what one might expect to be a tsunami of funding coming down the pipe over the second half of the IIJA period. So state revolving funds are key and critical and have played a big part. Another way, rather than, I think one of the challenges also is that, we can't wait on the federal government. We can't wait for a recession every 10 years to pay for our infrastructure and water problems. I think that's one of the broader challenges that we need to face. Rather than waiting for the crisis, we need to be more sustainable in our actions towards addressing the water wastewater challenges that we have. When it comes to another challenge with state revolving funds, though, however, are earmarks. And earmarks, which have sort of found their way back into Washington, are now increasingly cutting into state revolving funds and the dollars that are being outlaid to the states. In fact, it was the Environmental Policy and Innovation Center recently noted that lawmakers had directed $1.5 billion of 2.75 billion state revolving fund appropriations for fiscal year 2023 to earmarks. And so state revolving funds builds on itself. These are low interest loans. There may be grants for disadvantaged communities. But the fact of the matter is, over time, that begins to like a sandcastle at the beach. The less money that gets keep putting back into the system, it begins to dwindle over time. So one of the big questions, and really to Doug's point, there's always a discussion about P3s. We're increasingly seeing things like alternative delivery, finding ways to cut costs in the engineering, design, and construction. So that is one area that is growing. P3s are a difficult, as Doug pointed out, a complex challenge, and how we're going to deal with that. So the funding, it's going to have to come from more widespread, not only federal legislation, more sustained over time. People are getting creative, like I said, with alternative delivery and sort of the execution of the projects and project delivery. And then there's always the role of consolidation and privatization in some cases. But at this rate, we're only seeing about 135 privatizations of water utilities in any given year on average. So like I said, there are 50,000 water, 23,000 wastewater. So we've got a long way to go. So private companies only represent about 6% of the total ownership of water utilities in the US. But in the sake of time, I would just leave it with, this is the best that the water sector's position has been in a long time, if not ever, given the focus on climate and everything else around it. So I will pass it back to you, Bill.
Well, thanks, Reese. And that's great perspective. So now it's time for questions and discussion. Panelists, would you please unmute yourselves and switch your cameras on? And I'm going to take the prerogative and ask Senator Bradley to follow up on some issues that a couple of our speakers have brought up. Big needs for more legislation before the next recession, whenever that happens. Congress is having a very difficult time deciding on the time of day, much less on water policy. Can you see Congress addressing some of these issues without being faced with an emergency?
I am a little more hopeful after the foreign aid package passed, which was a bipartisan effort. I think the more explicit these panelists are and others as to what is the nature and severity of the crisis before us, if we fail to act, the better the chances will be that you'll get bipartisan action. Republicans and Democrats drink water, right? It shouldn't be a partisan issue. Now, it is true, if you just take the Central Valley project, that only 230 million out of the 3.7 billion that it costs will be repaid by the users. But the point is, it will be repaid. So I think this is a time where water could actually bring people together because it is so obvious, the need is so obvious. And I think that there was bipartisan support for the infrastructure bill. And so this is a matter of modifying and taking that support and moving it to something even more critical than roads and bridges, which is the supply of water to areas of this country that don't have it.
Thank you, Senator, for those optimistic hopeful comments, and also the call for us all, and for particularly the panelists, to articulate the need. And we'll come back to that. What is the need? What is the highest priority within water if Congress is to act? And we'll come back to that. But there's a question we have from Joe Coletti of the North Carolina General Assembly, which goes to how investments are decided, because they are decided on a level and there are so many priorities. So let me read the question. What are the processes when investors to consider when investing in water, wastewater infrastructure, flood mitigation, and disaster response in both upstream and downstream communities? How do communities weigh water concerns with the need for growth in making their investment decisions? So let's start perhaps with you, Reese, from your perspective, from the private sector. How do you see communities making these decisions?
Well, I think this is maybe the biggest challenge. There's only the pie is only so big, and it needs to be cut up into a number of different slices. I think, fundamentally everybody starts with drinking water. Obviously, that's where it kind of really all begins. I think water quality is paramount, and so you can't go a day without providing good, high quality or reliable source of drinking water.
So
thereafter, yeah. Go ahead.
Drinking water first. Howard, how do you see these decisions being made on a local level? And are they being made in a satisfactory, or consider the difficulty in the second best, most satisfactory we can?
And Nicole said this earlier about one water strategies and planning and integrated management, and how do you look at the entire water world together? And unfortunately, from my perspective, most of the money is going towards meeting regulations, which is good, but those regulations are very siloed, and the problems turn out to be things like it's the regulations that are driving whether money is spent to clean up a river or to build a new drinking water plant. And those are things that are being driven by EPA and the federal government, and not as much by local needs and local desires.
Doug, thank you, Howard. You're in the middle of this. How in San Antonio are these decisions made? How is this major decision to build this project that is transformative? How is that undertaken? How was that successfully done?
Well, we did have to, obviously had some rate impacts. I will say that our water rates were very competitive beforehand, but we did have to raise them. We had a series of 5 years worth of rate increases, so we spread it out over some time. But we tried to focus as much as we could. We've also looked at our rate structure and how we charge for water. And I think that's one of the important things we need to do is you need to determine your priorities. It was spoken earlier about drinking water. That's got to be job one. So that's first necessity. Maybe lawn watering isn't quite as important. So we do charge significantly higher as you get up into our higher tiers of water.
So Howard,
can I ask a follow-up question on that, Susan? Howard, you talked about the idea of reimagining water treatment. Our friend Eric Kim from Fitch Ratings, he was asking some questions on the new, very aggressive PFAS forever chemical standards. So number one, how difficult is this going to be for utilities to meet this? This is probably a great question for Howard and Nicole and Doug. And number two, what is the risk or the chance that if there's a change in administrations, that these regulations will be rolled back?
It's a fascinating, PFAS is a fascinating subject that'll be studied for many, many, many years. One CEO of a water utility said to me, Howard, if the EPA had decided on 14 parts per trillion, we would be fine, but they settled on 4 parts per trillion, and that's going to cost us a whole ton of money. So it's it's one of those those areas that's it's going to cost the water utility industry a lot of money to get down to 4 parts per trillion. And then you start looking at why are the drinking water ratepayers paying that? And why isn't it being stopped at the source and paid for by the people who manufactured and delivered these products? It's difficult to imagine that that anything's going to happen in the end, other than the water utility ratepayers are going to end up paying for this. It's an extremely lot of money, and perhaps there are other ways. But it's a difficult problem, and then you start thinking about is PFAS the biggest issue that's really out there, or is it the most politically sensitive issue at this point in time?
So a follow up with that, Howard, what are the other issues from your perspective that are equally urgent?
Well, it's everything, and it's all about really about our cities and our localities, and how do you keep them resilient and dealing with this climate change issue that's coming up. I think that's a huge issue that should involve a lot more than the water industry, but at this point in time, it looks like the water industry will be growing in terms of what its responsibility is to find new water sources and to protect people from flooding. And this is going to be a very, very large expense out west, as you heard from Doug, and also these ideas in California with they're reusing wastewater and treating that. It's all very, very expensive, and dealing with the PFAS issue is there with it, but it's not alone. When it becomes a regulation by EPA, it becomes the highest priority that's placed on the community, rather than looking at everything that's out there.
Well,
Is there
Nicole, you're
experience
in the center of this. I don't know how much, I don't know how far out on a limb you can go, but this is how is this rule going to be going to play out?
I mean, EPA recognizes it is going to be challenging to implement the PFAS rule. The rule itself includes several years for rule implementation to get in compliance with the maximum contaminant levels. Public water systems have 3 years to complete initial monitoring requirements. Then they have to inform the public of what the levels of PFAS were that are measured in the drinking water, and implement solutions to reduce PFAS below the standards within 5 years. I will say EPA is also taking additional actions under its PFAS strategic roadmap to hold polluters accountable for their actions and help pay for cleanups, and to reduce the amount of PFAS pollution actually entering the environment in the first place, so that that burden isn't borne solely by local communities. So I think that's an important piece of this for sure.
Nicole, could you expand upon that? What actions is EPA taking?
Well, like I said, they're all laid out in the strategic roadmap. It may include additional regulations, like Howard was saying, to really look at what can be discharged, right? That's the problem. We have people discharging currently at this time, and yet we're also trying to pay to clean it up. I will say, just to pick up on something Howard mentioned related to water reuse, I participated in the water reuse symposium in Colorado a few months ago, and many utilities are finding that as regulations increase, it is cost effective for them to consider water reuse, because they know what's in the water. They know what's in the water and what they need to do to clean it up to drinking water standards, versus, pulling from sources unknown. So that is a growing challenge for sure, but an innovative solution that folks are looking to.
May I pose an overarching question to all the panelists, following up on what Nicole said? So we've heard from others on the innovation that's going on right now. Innovation that we've seen in San Antonio to put water back, to recharge the aquifer. What is going to be the role of innovation going forward? How hopeful are you all that there will be investment that leads to more efficient outcomes and better outcomes for urban use of water across the country? Perhaps we can start with you, Doug.
Obviously, we're optimistic. You got to stay optimistic about things. So I think technology and new innovations will play a role. That's It's going to take some time though, and we are where we are right now with the existing tools that we have in our toolbox. We've got to figure out how to deal with some of these issues that are being talked about, including PFAS, lead and copper, just growth in general. So a lot of needs out there, and I know people get tired of rate increases, but you heard earlier somebody talked about 6% a year. Um, yeah, that's what we're seeing is those types of needs. We haven't been passing those on. We've been trying everything we can do to limit those, but that day is coming.
Reese, can we turn to you? Innovations and also financial innovations, increased use of P3s.
So what I would say is, as far as innovations technologically, the technology exists. That's not the problem. I think to that point, it's really paying for it and the will to do so and recognizing the value of the water. P3s are tough. I think SAWS is a perfect example. You have internal sponsors who drive it forward. That's really what it takes. But in the US as a whole, we've struggled with P3s across the broader landscape for various reasons. But there
So
are
part of the
other
solution,
performance.
not
Yeah, they're
not a silver
performance-based.
bullet. So let me
Yeah.
do a lightning round because we're coming to the end. What would be your single or action that the federal government should take to assist in these local outcomes? So perhaps we can start with you, Howard.
It's all about how does a utility raise rates sufficiently in order to put these things into place? And right
So
now
you
that's
don't see
limited.
any federal government
Federal government needs to put more money in if they can. I hate to say,
more money.
that's the solution, but
Doug, what do you want from the federal government? More money or something else?
No, probably more money would be the same answer there.
Okay, Nicole, you made the point that the federal government actually is not assisting as much as 50 years ago. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think more money would always help, but I also think lowering the bar to entry, we have more money available and technical assistance, but as some of the panelists mentioned, the requirements to be eligible and to access that money remain complex and varied.
We will be returning to the subject. Perhaps we can give a last word to Senator Bradley. Senator?
You're on mute, Senator.
On the panel, very interesting. I would just come back to where I started. To me, one of the key things is not simply wastewater, but it is supply. And I think there's a real crisis in supply, and that will take cooperation among federal, state, and local governments. And I think that having water priced at the market allows it to move to the places that need it the most and can afford it. And I think that's very important. I think it's much too heavily oriented toward agriculture today and not enough toward urban or industry. And so it's going to take a leadership on a lot of levels. And a lot of the leadership can come from this group.
Thank you, Senator. Market pricing, cooperation, collaboration across state, local, and federal. With that, we turn to Bill to close us out.
Well, thank you, Susan. And we're going to have to close the valve on this edition of Special Briefing. Up on your screen is contact information if you'd like to follow up with any of the speakers today. I'm sure there's a lot of questions we haven't had answered, but we'll be back to this topic before too long. And with that, thanks so much to Senator Bradley, of course, and to our terrific panelists. Thanks also to our co-host, Susan Wachter, and to the Volcker Alliance, members of the Penn IUR Board of Advisors and the Century Foundation, and of course, to our production team, Graham Dowd, Noah Wynn-Ritzenberg, Adalis Foster, Arden Jordan, and Megan Schmigdahl. And special thanks to you, our audience, for joining Special Briefing today. We'll be back on May 30th, Thursday, May 30th, to look at remote work and the future of New York and other big cities. A very weighty topic indeed. So watch your websites and your email for details. And remember to catch up on this and all of our other special briefings on our podcast. And so for now, I'm Bill Glasgall. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you in May.